Jean Goodwin Messinger is our guest today. She's an author. She was born and raised in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. She graduated from Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin, and she's lived in Colorado since 1952. Colorado Springs, I think, has been her home for most of that time. And she taught school here, and at age 50, she earned a master's degree in art and architectural history from Denver University. And she has written many books. And today she's talking about this one. It's called Voices from the Other Side.
And please excuse me for... Okay, please excuse me for reading. My memory isn't very good anymore. Do any of you have that problem? And so I don't stray, and so I don't forget something that I want to say. Now, are you hearing me okay? Okay. The seed for writing this book may have been planted in the 1970s when my husband and I were driving around the Normandy beachheads. We came to a spot in the main road where two cemeteries faced each other. Has anybody ever been there? Well, some genius planted those cemeteries. Each was filled with white, identical crosses, the same on both sides. One side was American, the other was German. I had previously never given much thought to the fact that each cross, wherever, also represented someone's son, husband, father, friend, and whatever. The Germans weren't all dedicated Nazis, as you know, and so some of these guys had enlisted to defend their country, and some were drafted, like our boys. But anyway, if they didn't follow what they were supposed to do, they got executed or imprisoned. So when I was working on this project, and I hope you will have the same reaction when you hear my talk, I wasn't looking at these people as the enemy. They were the enemy when all this happened, but now they're among us. Is anybody here a German immigrant? Good, okay. They go to our church, they live in our neighborhood, they are some even in-laws, some of them have married, and so we look on them just like anybody else. We don't stop to think that they were the enemy at one time, but when you hear their stories, a movie could be made from many of them. Now, the chapters will contain a lot of the same information, the same things happened, but I'm just telling that once, and just know that that happened to a lot of people, because I don't have time to do that for everybody. Okay, Frida Wust's family lived in Poland. After the Germans occupied Poland, Germans living there were required to move to East Germany, and Poles living in Germany were required to resettle in Poland. It was tricky, and they were not welcome because they had no assets, they required jobs, they didn't have ration cards, and wherever they went back that they didn't belong, they were not welcome. George Niedermeyer, at age 6 in 1931, when he was taken to Germany to meet his grandparents. His parents had immigrated to America, met and married here. So George was taken over to meet his grandparents. He stayed there and lived with them and other relatives for quite a while. He even went to school there and returned to America in 1936, when you know what was going on in Germany. Life was not the same for him here. His father had died, his mother had remarried, and he felt in the way. So he returned to Hitler's Germany. At 18, he was drafted into the German army and found army life there to be brutal at best. He had various non-combatant assignments, but he didn't find that his living conditions were any better there. And being an American, obviously, was not to his benefit. Shortly after the war ended in May of 1945, he was taken captive by American forces. I didn't know that happened, but there were a lot of these people that were in the army that were taken prisoner after the war ended. He was released in January of 1947. He was simply turned loose onto the street with no way to feed or house himself, and not wanted by anybody. He finally made it back to a family farm, and then when his mother learned of his survival, which she didn't know whether he was dead or alive for those 2 years, she urged him to come back home. He did, and life was good for him. He lived and retired in Loveland, and he's passed away now. I've included only 3 Jewish stories in my book because their ordeals have been pretty well documented and read by American audiences. Dr. Rudy Jacobson's story is one that has not reached much attention. Every lecture I give, I ask, what do you know about the St. Louis? I've never had anybody ever raise their hand that they had ever heard of the St. Louis. It was a German ship. Excuse me. It is a survivor story about a German boat named the St. Louis. The book has been written about them. It's called Voyage of the Damned, tells the complete story, and a movie was made of it in the 70s, and I'm going to try to locate those two. I don't know the title of the movie. It may be the same as the book. During the 1930s, the Gestapo was interning Jews, but also urging them to leave the country. When Dr. Jacobson was 6 years old in 1939, we're coming close to the war, Jews received documents from the Gestapo promising to sell their assets, give the government the proceeds, promise to leave and never return. And so 900 people got on the St. Louis. They had visas for Cuba. Well, when the boat got to Cuba, they found that those visas were not valid, and Cuba wouldn't accept them. 900 penniless, jobless Jews who couldn't speak the language. So they had no choice. They went up the coast of America, the Atlantic coast. No place would take them either. And President Roosevelt was told that he would lose the 1940 election if he let those Jews come into America. So they had no choice but to go back to Germany. They stopped at Antwerp. And in Antwerp, a few people were taken by the English, by the French, the Germans, and the Dutch. And Dr. Jacobson's family stayed in a refugee camp in Holland. And fortunately, some relatives in Milwaukee got their word and brought them back. It was right before the beginning of the war, and got them back, so they were fine. But he was a young boy when all this happened. He's telling me this story. The only people who survived the war from the St. Louis were the ones that went to England, because France and Holland and Belgium were all occupied by the German army. So the rest of these people went back to Germany, and they were put in concentration camps and executed. Isn't that a story? Never heard it before. Anita Griffith is not a common, her story is not a common one here. Her father was a medical doctor, and her mother came from an affluent family. Consequently, servants did everything, and Anita and her brother rarely saw their parents, just to be presented to them at bedtime and the first thing in the morning. Mother was an ardent admirer of Hitler, but father was not. He was sent to a concentration camp for making a joke about Hitler. It was not an uncommon thing that was happening. The SS or the police or the Gestapo or somebody would come in the evening and take Papa, and they would never see him again or have any idea whatever happened to him. And all it took was just to make an uncomplimentary remark about the Nazis, and that was enough to do that for you. Anita was the official a member of an official girls group. In fact, membership was compulsory. There was a lot that went on in Germany that required people to be Nazi, like the teachers to be Nazi members and things like that. Activities were much like Boy Scout training, with some politics thrown in for good measure. After graduation from 8th grade, everyone was required by law to work for 1 year in a household or a farm so they would learn to work hard. Anita's assignment was on a farm where there were 7 children, including a baby, a toddler, and a 3-year-old in diapers. Additional responsibilities were to milk 14 cows morning and evening, cook for the 14 Polish prisoners that were working on the farm, cook for the entire family, do the laundry, scrub floors, go on and on and on. All this by hand every day from 4 a.m. until 10 at night with no pay. Anita describes Russian occupation, which many of these people did, and it was just awful. And there were a lot of people that tried to get away from all of that. That's what brought a lot of them. They're not like it is on the border down, they weren't so concentrated, but they were everywhere. They were trying to get rid of the bombing and of the Russians. But this one that Anita describes, there were 21 Mongolians working on the farm who raped a neighbor's 14-year-old 21 times. Now, isn't that just unbelievable? Each day that Anita describes is more dramatic than the one before. Then she had a disastrous marriage, lots of moving, and finally found peace in Colorado Springs, where I knew her as a seamstress. Gernot Hanigsdorf I knew for nearly 50 years in Colorado Springs. He has now passed away. He was a highly regarded landscape designer and had a successful landscape business. His mother was the first female landscape architect on the European continent, but she was a little bit ahead of her time, and her family was embarrassed about her. I mean, she lived in a nudist camp for a while and that sort of thing. So her parents bought her some property in a little fishing village up on the North Sea to get rid of her. She ran a children's camp up there. And in the fall, in the end of the season, when the kids went home, some of the kids couldn't go home because their parents had disappeared. And so she adopted some of them that were Jewish. Their teacher, now these are kids, their teacher, Herr Pilla, was in the Gestapo and the SS. He protected those boys like the rest of the village did. After the war, during a Nazi crime trial, Gernot's mother testified on Herr Pilla's behalf, and he was released. Gernot's family military service is dramatic and varied, including arrest and internment in a Canadian camp. Then in 1948, 3 years after the war, he was mistakenly and probably maliciously labeled as a Nazi who had to be denazified. Crystal Pfeiffer's story describes the family 3-month refugee search for safety from the Russians beginning in Dresden. Now, several of my people lived in Dresden, and that was a very bad situation. Even the Allies during the war criticized the bombing of Dresden because it was militarily unnecessary and unproductive. In fact, it was a very historically highly cultured city, and without any military targets, it was a bad thing to go after targets. But Crystal's family had a 3-month search for help from Dresden. Alex Baumgartner was one of the German subjects who lived in Ukraine. He describes a caravan train of 40 refugee wagons heading back to Germany through Bulgaria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. And now remember, these people are not welcome anywhere they pass or threatened to settle there or anything. They were really a bad situation. He describes his military service in Poland and Germany, which included time as a war prisoner, in which he had no contact with his family for 2 years. And this often happened at the end of the war. Alex's wife, Irene, also originally from the Ukraine, describes life in Stalin's Russia, which was grim, particularly for people of means and success. Irene's father was a highly successful and popular physician who was summoned to the Soviet secret police office, questioned, and detained. When the family was able to see him, he looked like he had been tortured. Eventually, he disappeared, was never heard from again. The family never had any explanation for his detaining or his disappearance. Irene's first refugee situation occurred in 1941 when the Russian government, or remember at that time Ukraine was part of Russia, all citizens were to be resettled in Siberia. This involved 2 million residents, many of whom starved, froze, or died from inhumane treatment. Herman White was part Jewish, and after the Nazis came to power, his grandfather's clothing store was forced to fail, and Grandpa hung himself. The family moved to Hungary, and when the Russians invaded in 1944, it was time to go back to Germany, where life was even more difficult and dangerous. When the police came to arrest his father, Herman was forced to flee back to Hungary. As an undocumented alien there, he was prohibited from seeking a job. Life was unimaginable for him in many ways, persecuted as a Jew, forced to wear the yellow Star of David and not issued ration cards, and mistreated by the Germans, the Hungarians, and the Russians. On one occasion, young Herman and some of his friends were able to assassinate someone of authority. Herman doesn't identify the victim, but he was severely bothered psychologically by his part in that murder. He had to accept it as a retaliation for his own father's killing. Renata Justin describes outrageous treatment as a Jewish child in school, including avoidance by her teachers as well as by classmates. They were required to start each day by saluting the flag, raising one arm in a Nazi salute to Hitler, and singing the horse whistle song. I don't know anything about that. It was the teacher's custom to greet each student with a handshake when they came to school. Good morning, Hans. Good morning, Gretchen. When it came Renata's turn, the teacher did not extend her hand. She stood stiff and silent until Renata walked by, embarrassed and close to tears. The teacher also failed to call on her, even though her hand might be the only one raised. She was treated by everyone as though she were invisible. Her fellow students and friends stopped playing with her, and no one would accept her invitations to come to her house and play, and the parents experienced the same thing. People wouldn't come to the house. One day, her father received an official call that told him that if his daughter, Renata's older sister, didn't leave the country in the next 24 hours, both he and the girl would be jailed. That girl was immediately sent to an Italian boarding school, and at age 9, Renata and her younger sister were sent to a school in Holland for refugees. She was no longer permitted to go to school in Germany, and the teachers, all were required to belong to the party. Renata became a physician and practiced in Fort Collins. She has since passed on. Sabine Spearling's father rejected Nazism, but her mother was an enthusiastic believer. Her father was an Air Force pilot who was shot down in England and later transferred to the US. Being a POW in America was not a bad way to fight the war. One incident verifies that opinion, describes how the PWs working on a farm were complaining about not having enough milk in their diet, meat in their diet. The farmer went into his house, returned with rifles that he distributed to the prisoners, and told them to go hunting. The PWs did as they were told and returned to the farm with deer and rabbits, happy to supplement their diet. And I've got to tell you a little story of my own. When I was in high school in the summer, I worked in a Green Giant pea canning factory in Beaver Dam, and they had German PWs. I had somebody assigned to me. I couldn't have told you what he looked like because I never looked at him. I was scared to death of that prisoner. Well, the guys in the factory had the best time with those prisoners. And of course, the prisoners had a wonderful time there too. On Sunday, people from town, this was a very German town, people from town went to the fence that was around the county fairgrounds where they confined the prisoners, and they all sang Deutschland über alles. Okay, Moody. Regina Wolf was a young mother living in East Prussia who had to smuggle her 3 small boys out to save them from the Russian advance into Germany. She did this by walking across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and back into Germany, looking for her husband on the way, who was in the German military force. After 6 weeks on the road, she needed to get something for her hungry boys to eat. One night she stopped and camped in a forest on the bank of a small stream. Buildings of a farm stood nearby. The next day, Moody left the boys and went to the farmhouse to beg for something to feed those starving boys. The man seemed a little strange to her and asked her where the boys were. Then he summoned Moody to the barn, telling her he would give her some potatoes if she would pitch some hay for him. While she was pitching hay, he attacked her. She was able to defend herself with the pitchfork and send him in retreat. She hid in the barn, and eventually the couple left the house, and she returned to the boys with an ample supply of potatoes. Ursula Stack, can you hear me okay, everybody? Okay, Ursula Stack's story is rare in our stories because her aristocratic dad was an enthusiastic Nazi, a member of the Brown Shirts and the Gestapo. The family didn't know exactly what he did during the war, but he turned mean and abusive, and Ursula's mother divorced him. Ursula explains, quote, "Toward the end of the war, there was more bombing, twice daily, once by Britain, once by the US, shortages, campaigns against Jewry, lack of food, destruction of the city. They lived in Berlin. And can't you imagine what life in Berlin was like during the war?" Ursula was in the girls' group, equivalent to the boys' group previously described. They all took an active role in parades and rallies. She saw Churchill, Chamberlain, and Mussolini. One day in a parade, she was pushed by the crowd and fell in front of Hitler's car. So, since her parents were divorced, they rarely saw their dad. He was high in the military. After the Russians came in, he was perused because he was known for being in the Gestapo. He made a quick stop to their house to let the family know that he was a wanted man, and they never saw him again. Ursula married an American GI. German families were generally glad the GIs were there for their daughters, even though they knew that they would leave Germany. Fraternizing was strictly forbidden by the US, but obviously some did it. Steve Lani lived in Austria, and after the Anschluss of 1938 unified Austria and Germany, pre-war Austria was similar to the routine of officialdom in Germany. At age 10, Steve was required by law to join the Hitler Jugend. It consisted of meetings, marching, singing, summer camps, learning military skills like identification of airplanes, learning to shoot and maintain rifles. It stressed discipline, good health habits, community service, and camaraderie. Steve says there was limited juvenile delinquency during the Nazi regime. At the end of the war, schools and dormitories were closed and became shelters for refugees and occupation troops. Consequently, Steve left school after the 8th grade, as many of them did, and went to work. And after the war, the entire family came to America. Karl Finzel was raised in Luxembourg. In the German army, he became a prisoner of the English. At a PW camp there, Polish guards were brutal. Later, Karl was taken to Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, where he was well treated and paid $1 a day. The Luxembourg government assumed that all German residents were Nazis, so the government took all their possessions. Karl's family had to live in one rented room. They eventually made it back to Germany after the war as refugees. Generally, and I've said this before, refugees returning to their native country were not welcome. They were resented because they took food, jobs, and housing that were shortened because of the war. Doris, Karl's wife, describes how school children had to listen to lengthy tirades on the radio by Hitler, then write about it. Everyone was required to salute constantly, and of course, teachers were required to belong to the Nazi Party. After the war, there was no school for a year in many locations. When Doris graduated from school, she said there was never a lesson about World War II. She writes about the requirements to be denazified after the war if a person was indeed a party member. Everyone was required to belong. Those who didn't were often arrested or executed. Dr. Hans Holzapfel. His father was a PhD nuclear physicist who knew Einstein. He refused to join the Nazi Party and was dismissed from his employment. As a result, the family lived in poverty. The German population generally didn't know about they all say this, they generally didn't know about the concentration camps in the 30s. They thought in terms of work camps. They only knew that Jews and Friends were disappearing. Many times their furniture would just be put out on the street. Then people knew they've gone somewhere. Dr. Holzfassel does speak, as all my subjects do, of good treatment by American occupiers who dispensed nylons and perfume to the Frauleins and candy to the kids. Socializing was forbidden, but obviously something managed to happen. Although the German parents didn't like losing their daughters to America, they were glad for the opportunities here, and there were not very many young German guys for them to marry. I'm almost done. Helga Kelly Bach's family owned and operated a hotel restaurant that 2 German Jewish people frequently visited. When Nazi procedures threatened, Helga's parents hid them in the attic. An employee snitched on them, and the government took over the hotel. Helga's family continued to live in and operate the hotel at no wages. Eventually, they moved in with an aunt who was German sympathetic. She treated them miserably, not allowing them food or use of the bathroom. Lastly, Eric Bootlein put his memoirs into a book, and I could do the entire lecture on his story. His story contains everything reported in the rest of the stories, plus a lot more. His parents took over a small resort lodge, pictured on the cover of my book, wherever it is. And the publisher very cleverly put a swastika over that picture. It's a picture of his the inn that his parents owned and operated, and Eric is sitting on a hillside looking down on it, and then they put that swastika over it because that's exactly what happened. They were forced to close that operation because his mother ignored regulations related to wartime shortages and rationing. She bought a pig from a neighboring farmer, which of course was very popular on her guest menu, and it was reported to authorities. She was tried and sentenced to 3 months in prison for a crime against the German war economy. Win Schendel. Is Win here? There he is. I'm looking around. Hadn't seen him for a long time. I didn't recognize. Well, I've copied Win's story, and if anybody wants it, and if he's agreeable, you can copy it and keep it. It's in the book. But the thing I want to tell you about Win's story is something very unusual in memory. The family was driving through the city of Beirut and stopped to make a visit to the grave site of composer Richard Wagner. It turned out to be a memorable encounter as Hitler and staff members drove up while the family was there. Hitler was a known devotee of Wagner's works, and this was not a ceremonial occasion. There were no other visitors. So Win's mother urged the young lad to approach the Fuhrer, greet him, and shake his hand, which he did properly. Heil, mein Fuhrer. Hitler turned to accept the greeting, accidentally stepping on Win's foot. His shoe came off in the process. Apparently, the Fuhrer was unaware of the situation or chose to ignore it and didn't acknowledge what gave Win a lifelong distinction and a very special memory. Lastly, I'm just going to make a couple references to Japan. These stories, I think, are in my other book, Same War, Different Battlefields, and this is accounts of how the war impacted people as civilians. When President Roosevelt issued the 9066 issue that said all foreigners from the West Coast had to leave, he didn't say Japanese. He said foreigners, but of course everybody knew that he meant Japanese. Well, the 10 governors from the Western states got together and said, now, what are we going to do about this? Governor Carr of Colorado said, now, wait a minute. These are American citizens. They haven't done anything. If they want to come to Colorado, they'll be welcome. We'll take good care of them. Well, that position was not well liked by the public, and his life was threatened. He had to go about with an armed bodyguard. Well, later he was regarded as a hero, and there's a monument or a memorial, I don't know what it is, on a street in downtown Denver to him, that they finally recognized that he was a very humane guy. And lastly, I want to read Mary Shibao's story. She's Japanese in Colorado. Mary's story makes an appropriate ending for our discussion. Her father was a Japanese immigrant who came to this country as a worker on the railroad in 1909, as a lot of Japanese did. When the project reached Colorado, like many other Japanese workers, he stopped and settled as a farm worker in northern Colorado and changed his name to Harry. Eventually, he brought a farm, as a good many of those people did. Northern Colorado is full of Japanese owners and farms. And he got a bride from Japan and raised a family of 9 children. Mary was born in Hill Rose near Fort Morgan, and the family later moved to Gering, Nebraska. Mary's mother died in a fire. At the same time, Harry's father in Japan died, and Harry decided to take his family to Japan to look after his elderly, widowed mother. But being back in Japan didn't suit Harry after he'd lived in America for a while, and he returned to Gering with the children, but he left 11-year-old Mary in Japan to look after her grandmother. Mary hoped and expected to return to Colorado, but never did. And then the war got in war, and the family lost touch with each other. She got along okay as an American. She got teacher training and took a job in a school in a town near Hiroshima. On a beautiful August day in 1945, the children were in a big gathering room having a program. Suddenly, there was an enormous flash of light, like lightning, but it was a nice day, followed by a tremendous crash. The building shook, and thinking it was an earthquake, the building was evacuated. When they got outside, of course, they saw that very famous cloud over Hiroshima. Not knowing about the radiation, a couple of days later, volunteers were sent over to the city to help. Mary and a couple of other teachers got on the train, but the tracks soon gave out and they were forced to walk. Of course, they didn't get very far when it was obvious that the landscape was full of black stumps where there had been buildings. Nothing could be done, and so they turned back. I asked Mary what she thought about the bombing. She looked at the floor, cleared her throat, looked up at the ceiling, and finally said, "I just wish there had been a different way." I replied that I thought a lot of Americans felt that way, but it ended that war that we didn't start. We were scheduled to invade Japan in October, which I have read in several places, it's not surprising, would have destroyed the country, and the likelihood that 1 million lives would have been lost, including Americans. So that's the end of my story. There are a lot more in the book, and I don't know if your library has it. I don't have any more books to sell, and I don't know if your library has it, but if they don't, then they can get a copy from you from another library. So I'm open now for questions or comments, or anybody that has had any personal experience with any of this sort of stuff.
Anybody have questions?
It's a pretty awful thing to go through, isn't it? And how I don't think I could have done it. Well, thank you very much for coming and for your attention.
Thank you very much.